Welcome to the Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show, where cutting-edge science meets innovation and practical application for everybody. In today's episode, I sit down with the Metabolic CEO, Shalin Shah. He's the CEO for Marius Pharmaceuticals, and he has brought the FDA-approved drug, Kyzatrex, which is oral testosterone, to market. In this episode, we sit down and we learn all about testosterone, where testosterone has come from, where it is in the present space in the pharmaceutical industry, and so much more. Please join me in sitting down with Shalin Shah. This episode has been supported by Marius Pharmaceuticals. Shalin Shah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm actually really, really excited to have this conversation. I want to give you a little bit of a backstory, which I don't know if you know this. So you are the CEO of Marius Pharmaceuticals, and which, by the way, has been instrumental in the development and FDA approval of something called Kyzatrex, which is oral testosterone.
Yep.
Okay. So let's talk about, let's just give the listeners a little bit of a background. My husband he was a former Navy SEAL who is now in his second year of urology residency, happens to be at Baylor, which is one of the number one places that one would be able to study andrology, specifically testosterone and other anabolics, who works underneath Dr. Mohit Khera, who, by the way, is a very good friend of yours and who's also doing some of the really pivotal research in...
Yep. Mo is a close advisor and friend and has really been helpful in bringing light to, obviously, the therapy and Kyzatrex itself.
Which is amazing. So I said, from my perspective as someone who sees patients, I was always thinking that really the most effective route and understanding of testosterone would be injectable.
Yep.
And there were various challenges that I was having with some of my patients. Like, for example, when you inject testosterone, you might see a quick elevation in hematocrit, right? And for the listener, for the other physicians listening, that there might be a risk of, whether it is a perceived risk or a relative risk, it is still within the guidelines that you would need to really monitor hematocrit and treat it specifically. Which brings me to when I called him, I said, okay, Mo, what are my options? And I had never heard about Kyzatrex before or any form of oral, which I assume, and from what I understand, there are 3.
Yep.
Oral testosterone.
Right. Yep.
So that was a very long-winded way of welcoming you to the podcast, and I'm so excited to learn. You've really been doing some very instrumental work.
No, I appreciate that. And again, super glad to be here. I think there's a lot that the general population needs to know. Testosterone has it's a very misunderstood molecule, to be honest, right? And I think it's very important for patients and prospective patients to understand what it does, what its role is, and then yes, what the options are, what's going to fit them. But we are really excited about Kyzatrex because I think not only oral has solved an administration pain, quite literally pain that's been out there, but the efficacy and safety data that we continue to unfold, I think make it more and more compelling that this will be the standard of care.
Can you tell me a little bit about, I'm curious as to how you got involved in this, because
Sure.
I do think that there is something really important in the conversation of being able to separate, quote, big pharma and pharmaceutical interventions like testosterone therapy.
Sure. So I have an investment background. I've been doing that all my career. And
you did your undergrad at Rutgers, by the way.
Yep.
Small world.
Yeah, exactly. So also a Northeast, resident in that sense. But yeah, so I've had this background and we've generally looked at let's call it underappreciated assets and finding value within them. So Kyzatrex was in development since 2009, and this all happened in the RTP area, and that's where Marius is headquartered. So great data. The formulation that it developed was very unique. It actually used something called phytosterols, which plant sterols are often used as supplement products for heart health and so forth. So that's really how they crack the code on oral, because oral, again, was notoriously hard to develop. Going back to very early days, it was always liver toxic. So they had to find a way that it was lymphatically absorbed, which, again, that's through the small intestine.
Right. And when was the first oral testosterone was how long ago?
So actually, interestingly enough, the first oral testosterone is when they actually isolated testosterone in 1935. So it was almost 100 years that was the original conception of testosterone, but it was liver toxic.
It was liver toxic.
So that wouldn't work, right? And that's why they moved to injectables. And if you look at the timeline, then injectables morphed into testosterone, cypionate, and enanthate in the 50s. And then it wasn't until the 1970s or so there actually was a oral testosterone that was developed that was not liver toxic. The issue there was that it was requiring dosing 3, 4, 5 times a day with fatty meals, right? For absorption, because the half-life was so short. But it actually got approval in pretty much everywhere around the world except the United States. So the US was the only place that didn't have this tool available, and this was in the 70s. So fast forward another 40 years almost.
Was there a reason why it wasn't approved?
So I think, again, FDA, while is the gold standard across most of the world, I think there are, issues at the agency, and happy to dive into that later specifically, because I think this therapy has been frankly mistreated by the FDA, and patients are the ones suffering. But again, so I don't think there's a real rhyme or reason why it wasn't here. I think there, you can probably find the same for a few drugs across the spectrum. But then again, it was 40 years or so till then an oral testosterone that really cracked the code of yes, it's BID dosing, but
which is twice a day.
Twice a day, yes, twice a day. But the food effect has changed drastically. So you don't, for Kyzatrex, for example, you don't need to have a super fatty meal. You need to take it with food, but you don't have to have that 30, 40, 50 grams of fat, which most people would never have for a meal, right? So that's fast forward to today. Now you have that tool in the toolbox that I think really, again, it changes the paradigm for where I think testosterone therapy can go.
Where do you think it is when you think about the understanding for the general population, where do you think their perception is versus what potential realities are for, we hear a lot of things that are actually Dr. Mohakera has really dispelled. For example, testosterone will cause issues, cardiovascular issues. We know that that is not true. There is potentially a role of low testosterone in various different problems like metabolic syndrome. The list goes on. Osteoporosis, depression. But from your perspective as someone who is really trying to bring Kyzatrex and just testosterone in general to the mainstream, where do you think the barriers are?
Understanding, I think if you look at the whole pie, right? I think if you look at half the folks out there, they don't know anything about testosterone at all. So even the male population, understanding that it's a vital hormone to them, I think 50% of the population is unaware of it. I think 40% of the population still carries these misconceptions, whether it is the cardiovascular risk, the prostate cancer. I mean, even urologists and cardiologists still hold on to some of these notions, whether they were frankly trained a long time ago or haven't kept up, or again, we just get rooted in these notions. I think that is 40% of the people. And then maybe 10%, I think, actually understand. And those are, maybe a lot of the folks that listen to your show or see, great physicians like yourself to help not just, feel better and live, a better health span, but really want to improve their underlying metabolic health. I think that's 10% today maximum.
Why do you think that there are such huge barriers? Do you think it's an education?
It's absolutely an education issue. Again, you have testosterone has been around for almost 100 years, and you just have these periods where I think the public and the medical community have been, I don't want to say scared, but
definitely scared. Even as providers. I would say that if you are not in andrology, which is again the study of, or in part the study of sex hormones, especially testosterone, and someone who's been doing it, then you've been afraid.
Right. Yeah. And you have such little training. And again, it's changed. So I think there have been small spurts where I actually liken it to, GLP-1s today, right? Every 2 weeks, you will see a new research paper that says, I think GLP-1s are useful in this indication or that indication. I think testosterone actually had some of those, silver linings. And then again, it's been mixed up with a lot. And even, in 1990, Congress scheduled testosterone as a controlled substance.
Do we know why?
So this was really an outcry to Olympic doping. I think, you had other countries that were using this more, and that was a disadvantage for the U.S., and there's public outcry. So there was actually, at the time, it's very important to know, the FDA opposed it, the DEA opposed it, the AMA opposed it. So
they did. They
all opposed the scheduling.
Making testosterone scheduled. And for listeners, scheduling the drug makes it difficult to acquire.
Yes.
There's just barriers to being able to get the drug.
It changes the perception immediately, right? Yeah. Because again, controlled is bad, right? And then yes, it is an issue for providers across the board to get access to these medications, and that basically limits the amount of people who will be on therapy.
And there was an uproar about it. The AMA, they opposed.
Everyone opposed it. Yeah, exactly. There were letters, everything was written. So it was interesting enough. It was actually Joe Biden in 1990 that led that charge.
That is fascinating.
So kind of we've come full circle here for sure. And I'll talk more about it later. We are launching a nonprofit that descheduling is a core tenet or mission of what that nonprofit is going to do.
And when it wasn't scheduled up until the 90s?
Correct.
Which means someone could go to their physician's office and say, I would like to try testosterone, and correct. I would like to try it in an off-label use. I think still 80% or so of testosterone usage is off-label.
Most use is off-label. And here's, again, fascinating part of the history. So until around 2014, there was in testosterone labels, the indication actually read for primary, secondary, and something called idiopathic. So what that means is
idiopathic hypogonadism.
Exactly. So what that means is that we don't know the reason why you have this condition, but you have it. So we should treat it. Just like pretty much every other condition. You think about high blood pressure, you think about cholesterol, you think about depression. Physicians don't, again, root cause is great to know, but at the end of the day, we also need to attack what's going on or treat what's going on. So that is the standard practice of medicine, right? But in this instance, testosterone has been singled out, and that has been removed from the label. So
Wait, what do you mean it's been removed from the label?
Idiopathic, yeah.
How would just randomly they decided that you...
Because the FDA does not like testosterone. Controversial statement, FDA does not like testosterone. So they pulled it, and they said, let's make it harder to get. So let's make this physician who knows this patient should be treated jump through hoops.
Yeah.
So not only do you have that controlled problem, you also have this label issue. Again, it doesn't, at the end of the day, you know, clinicians have the right and judgment, and they can do that. But it adds to this issue around the whole therapy.
It does. And if we were to define low testosterone levels, they seem to continue to move the
goalpost
lower and lower.
Absolutely. So as recent as, I think this was 2017, LabCorp's reference range, the bottom of the reference range was something like 320, 340 nanograms per deciliter. That was the bottom and considered, the cutoff. Now, I believe that number's around 268. Right. And even I've seen some reference ranges drop to 222.
Yes.
Right.
And that is considered, quote, normal within range.
Exactly. So, and again, you know this because of the way that you practice, but reference ranges are really a reflection of our population. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody knows our population is not healthy. So at large, so we are, our goalposts, we're measuring ourselves against something that we should not be or aim for.
Yeah. And it's definitely not optimization. If we were thinking of really how do we age well, how do we continue to have a meaningful muscle span, which is the length of time we live with healthy skeletal muscle and able-bodied, if we continue to move the goalpost lower and lower, and then the other, south. And then the other thing is, how is it, and I was looking at some of the guidelines yesterday, how is it that a 20-year-old is still within the same reference range as a 65-year-old?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense.
It was really arbitrary when they had come up with it, right? I think, a lot of people in the space akin it to throwing a dart at the wall, saying, all right, this is the reference. This is the number you should be. And again, it's variable, just like most other, things in your body, right? We measure glucose in the body, and that changes day to day. But whatever you showed up to in that lab is how the physician is going to base your treatment on. And here you have something the same. One day you might be 280, one day you might be 300. So I think what we have to do is definitely look at symptoms. That is obviously the most important factor. But again, understanding its role in the metabolic health of a person. And I think now with the advent of oral, you have the ability to still optimize better so you can improve these underlying factors, whether it is cardiovascular health, whether it is cognitive function, and so forth. So that's where I think the research needs to be done. Again, these are not indications today, but that's where we know the research should focus on, because we know the reasons why low testosterone is bad. That there's thousands of papers.
Puts you at risk for a multiple of
diseases,
things.
right?
Yes.
And again, big things that are big problems in our societies, whether it's type 2 diabetes and so forth. Mm-hmm. So we know why low testosterone is bad. We've firmly figured out that it's not risky for cardiovascular disease or prostate cancer, and those studies are unequivocal at this point, right? So now I think the research can finally be free and say, look, here truly are the benefits, right? So that's where really we want to spend a lot of time, is just on the next frontier.
Yeah.
So whether that is as a GLP-1 combo or
tell me more about that, because that's really fascinating. Marius Pharmaceuticals, do they do other?
So we are supporting a lot of outside research right now. So
okay.
we have not launched the trials ourselves yet. I think a lot of this goes back to us working with the FDA and figuring out trial sizes and so forth. But we know there's tremendous interest, right? So again, GLP-1s, for example, the whole conversation around muscle loss,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
It's been pretty much front and center. And obviously, yes, are there a lot of foundational things that you should be doing? Protein intake is super important. Strength training, wholeheartedly agree with these things. But we know population and sort of how they act. So what pharma is doing, and we don't really lump ourselves in there.
I also think that you should lay the foundation a little bit, because basically what I want people to get out of this episode, number one, is understanding that they have other options, and understanding a little bit about the history of how we got to where we are. Because arguably, I believe in testosterone therapy for both men and women. I think that from what I've seen, it's been demonized, even if a small sector of the population, like myself and some other people that are really interested in longevity, believe in it, like yourself and our colleagues at Baylor and various other places. To the large perception, it is still controversial. It is still unobtainable. They feel like it's cheating, or, it's almost like saying, if you go on testosterone therapy, that's cheating. But then I would say, cheating what? And if you're a woman, you're going to go through menopause.
Right.
What is so you do hormone replacement, including testosterone, and that's cheating what? Feeling terrible?
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. They should not be, folks should not be subjected to these things. I think it actually goes back to testing, right? Honestly, if you think about testing, frankly, every male over 40 should be tested, and every female over 40 should be tested, right? To understand, what that level is, because again, more and more so, you're seeing these deficiencies. If it's actually interesting, if you think about your overall health and diagnostic testing these days, testosterone is the single most telling barometer of your overall health, because it's not, again, you think lipid panels or whatnot, your cardiovascular or glucose, you're thinking insulin, but testosterone will give you an insight into your cardiovascular health, your glucose metabolism, your inflammation in your body, right? Inflammation is the root cause of almost all disease. So it's mind-boggling to me that and it's a cheap test. It's less than $10.
Yeah.
And yet, if I were to walk into my primary care and say, "Hey, can you test my testosterone?" They say, "Why?"
They definitely would say, that's wild. And I will give you some statistics. Approximately 40% of men aged 45 and over are hypogonadal, meaning their body doesn't produce enough testosterone. A U.S. study estimates an additional 190 to $525 billion in healthcare expenditures over 20 years due to testosterone deficiency. This list goes on. Men with impaired fasting glucose or impaired glucose tolerance typically have hypogonadism, again, low testosterone. I mean, again, this list goes on, and it's not just for men, it's also for women. Women seem to be understudied when it comes to testosterone. And I will also say, this is interesting. It says a lifetime risk of progression from prediabetes to diabetes is as high as 74%.
Right. Yeah, no, it's so that's why I said the research is really clear, and it's been repeated and reproduced over and over again. And there's, the papers are also there that testosterone deficiency or low testosterone will result in higher all-cause mortality. Full stop. Right? Like there's nothing more, greater than saying, hey, you will die sooner if you have testosterone deficiency. And that has effectively been shown in the research and the literature. So again, testing, understand if there's an issue.
Where do you think we could go with, do you think that there's any chance that we'll be able to put a more reasonable guideline together? Meaning, and I understand that, you're not a practicing physician, but again, you are in the business of bringing this to market, which is critical. And we need that. We need people that are willing to fund research so that someone like Dr. Mohakera or Lipschultz can go out and do this and gather this kind of data, or Rachel Rubin, our friend Rachel Rubin. Do you think that there will ever be a time, and again, this is your opinion, that we can change the the values, the numbers of where, is low testosterone in men really 220 nanograms per deciliter? Is low testosterone in women really, free testosterone really normal at 0.5, you know?
Right.
I mean, it's crazy.
I think, the optimist in me is saying yes, right? I think we are sort of entering this renaissance of hormones, right?
I've never heard that before. You said that we're entering this hormone renaissance.
Absolutely. Because just take the female side, right? Pre-WHI, there were 40% of women were on hormone therapy. Menopausal women, 40% of women pre-WHI were on.
The Women's Health Initiative.
Yes, exactly.
Really?
Which the study we know is total garbage, been debunked, retracted, everything, right? But now, because of that, still 22 years later, there are 1.8% of females in menopause are on hormone therapy.
Wait. This is so important. We have to take a pause. 40% of menopausal women were on hormone replacement therapy up until the Women's Health Initiative.
Correct. 2002.
In 2002. And then the Women's Health Initiative came out and talked about how dangerous estrogen and progesterone. I don't know how much they talked about testosterone.
They did not talk about it. It was mainly, synthetic progesterone and estrogens. And that was the primary bit. That
for 20 some years completely destroyed the public perspective as well as the physician perspective.
Absolutely.
Of using hormone replacement. Decimated. So it went from 40% before the Women's Health Initiative to what did you say?
1.8% today.
That's disgusting.
Yeah.
1.8%.
Yep.
And so now we're backfilling all this information of the positives of hormone replacement.
And I think, again, how do we change these things? Your question. I think patients, that's why we spend a lot of time trying to educate, and we really want to empower patients, right? I'd love for the medical community to come along, and there is, again, like a percent that is doing it, but I think the patients have to be advocates for their own health. And how do we arm them with the right information so they can go and do that? Because not everyone is going to go to a functional care doctor or integrative medicine and whatnot. They're still going to their primary care or urologist and so forth, or their OB, right? And they have to advocate for themselves. So I think it's critical for us to educate them, and I think that will help. As backwards as it seems, that will help the societies get along and change the guidelines over time, because they will see and believe it more, right? They'll reluctantly maybe start, and I think that tide will shift.
And how is Marius different than, say, quote, big pharma? How would the person who's listening think about big pharma versus various other pharmaceutical type initiatives?
Sure. I mean, I think it even starts with Kyzatrex in itself, right? Kyzatrex is aimed at a problem that is large, right? Even just, again, let's just say for males.
So we know that 40% of men over the age of 45 have hypogonadism.
Correct. So you're in 20 to 25 million men easily.
Oof.
And then again, you think about the female population, again, has to be researched and indicated for, so forth, but I think the numbers are quite staggering. So what we've seen is this trend of big pharma focusing on rare disease, right? And rare disease is important, but why? It really comes back to the way our system is set up and, frankly, reimbursements. So it's a lot easier to get reimbursed for a rare disease drug than it is a mass market drug. So that's really where the calculus has been over the last, let's call it 2 decades. And I think so we saw this as a mass market problem, but not as an issue around reimbursement, to be honest. We thought this helps people, it will do well. So that was part of the reason that we actually forego the insurance path, working with PBM, signing insurance contracts. We said, hey, this product should be cash, and let's make it accessible to as many people as possible.
And big pharma, when one hears the term big pharma, is there a standard definition for that?
I don't think there's a standard definition.
Okay.
I think there's obviously, you can look at the size of the companies and so forth. But again, for us, we really consider ourselves different, because I think this is more on the disease prevention side. Where can we come and help the healthcare system, right? We want to save dollars to the system, which is, frankly, here in the U.S., one day away from imploding, right? So
1 hour.
Yeah, 1 hour. We're minutes away from this, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So how do we save this system and actually pull dollars out for the benefit of, patients, providers, and again, the country, if you will.
And can you tell me a little bit about how the oral testosterone is absorbed? So it's lymphatic absorption.
Yes.
Also, the length of time that it stays in the system, right? So there's cypionate, propionate. There's, they seem to have various half-lives.
Correct.
What would be, and also just the impact of oral. Oral seems to not raise blood pressure as much as an injectable would. And it seems to have less of an impact on hematocrit, things of that nature.
Correct.
And maybe even potentially fertility.
Yep, that is, again, we're running a study
Huge.
there. I think that data is going to be, there's an abstract being published in October 2024. We'll see the full results in 25. But the data is pretty encouraging. So we're excited for that to be announced. But in terms of how it works in comparison, or again, by itself, daily, oral is taken daily, right? And that's actually twice daily right now. So what we see is...
Which is great, an improvement from 3 to 4 times a day.
Exactly, yeah, from previous versions and whatnot. So this is definitely rather convenient for men, right? We live in a society, we're pretty used to taking pills. We're usually taking a number of supplements. So everybody has their box that they're getting ready at the beginning of the week and or traveling with it and so forth. So the half-life, what we see is around 5-6 hours, right? And then usually you take a dose in the AM and you're taking a dose in the PM. What we're seeing is that...
And what's the total milligram dosage?
So there's a range of doses that are available, to titrate depending on if that patient is a super responder or where they fall on the spectrum in terms of response. But most commonly, we see 400 milligrams BID.
And it's important for people to understand that is not the same as injecting.
Correct. You cannot sort of just equate what Kyzatrex is doing to an injection in terms of the quantities, right? Because again, this is being delivered through your small intestine, and bioavailability differs. But ultimately, you look at the result in the labs, right? But what we're seeing or what we're starting to understand is that because testosterone is produced on a daily basis anyway in your body, right? That's the circadian rhythm. When you go to sleep, you're obviously producing your hormones, and that's peaking in the morning and going down throughout the day. The closer you can mimic that without going to supraphysiological levels, and supraphysiological, what I mean by that is then, often injections take you to, it could be actually post-injection data would show you could be at 4,000 nanograms per deciliter.
Well,
just immediately post-injection, right?
Everyone would, I'm sure all the guys would love that.
Yeah, but we don't want to do that.
No, we don't want to do that.
We don't want to do that. I'm sure it's a great feeling too.
I don't know what to ask Matt, the producer. I'm just kidding.
But and again, as more folks are using this, you want to reduce the chance of error. But by reducing these high supraphysiological levels for extended periods of time, what we see in the data for Kyzatrex is, say the hematocrit, for example, sub 2% of our patients developed a hematocrit level above 54. And then also that was being, if you down titrate, that was solved for. And if you look at some of the real world data, and we have abstracts being published on this as well, you can also take a patient that has high hematocrit, and then they can lower that by switching to an oral.
From an injectable.
Exactly.
Which I think is a real benefit, because we know that injectables increase hematocrit. And that's the one thing where people don't necessarily want to go donate blood. It's a bit of a hassle. They might not, again, some people feel great, some people don't. But if we can avoid that, then that's wonderful. And also travel.
Right.
We have a lot of guys that travel, and also I definitely want to talk about women. The idea of and my husband, am I allowed to say this, was in one of the studies for Kyzatrex?
Please share.
So I have wife clearance, so I'm allowed to say all the things. I don't know. So yes, he was, and he loved it.
Right.
And he found it super convenient, and how he did it was he would take it in the morning with a meal, and then he would take it in early afternoon, as opposed to take it in the evening, and he felt great. I don't know what dose he was titrated up to, but I do know that his levels were considered more optimal for him. And I think he personally sits around 900, which is where he feels great. So I'm curious as to 400 milligrams, it goes up to 400 milligrams twice a day.
Correct.
Do we know, because absorption is variable, do we know if someone is on 400 twice a day, how much of an increase we would expect? So if someone is, let's say they're at 300, I'm sure you have hyper responders that would go to 600 or 900.
Correct. So even at a slightly lower dose, on average, if you take your hypogonadoal male, and this is data from our phase 3, so they would probably be on average at low 2s, right? Their C max would actually be in the 900s. So, you have that 700
that's amazing.
Roughly point increase to Cmax. And again, this is a daily rhythm, right? So you're hitting that on a daily basis, but then at the end of the day, you're going back down to your baseline. So that allows, what we see in the data is that the LH and FSH, right? The signals that are coming from your brain to produce testosterone are not going to zero.
And why is that? And I think this is really important for people listening, and especially for the younger population. Fertility is a big thing. Right. And it's fair to say that if someone is trying to get pregnant or wanting to have a child, that they should not be on testosterone replacement therapy. I will also say that people feel really terrible when they are coming off of testosterone replacement therapy. I mean, there's ways to do it in which you do a titration. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is that it seems as if the oral doesn't affect fertility the same way. Is that fair to say?
I think that, again, the data will definitely show that. So we're really excited to get that out into the public domain. But I think as a surrogate on understanding what's happening to those signalings not dropping, then those obviously affect, the sperm counts in those males. So again, the data will kind of play out, but I think we kind of use the analogy of, and this applies for men in general, right? If they're just considering testosterone replacement therapy. We have a factory. It's working, right? Or maybe it's not working so well. So we're deciding to go on testosterone therapy. If you're going on an injection, you are likely shutting down that factory and sending all those workers home. Factory's closed. No, not operational. If you're taking oral, because again, using the LH and FSH as the surrogates, it's more like, okay, we're going to shut down some of the equipment, we're going to send some people home, but we're still going to be working.
You guys are going to have a long lunch hour. Everything is going to be fine.
Yeah, exactly. We'll bring you back when the time's ready. So the lights are staying on, right? And this actually, even if you're not concerned with fertility, we don't have reports of testicular atrophy.
Which is also a really big deal. You don't?
We don't have reports of testicular. We did not see it in our trials, and we did not see it in, again, some of the abstracts that will be published in the near term.
Isn't that amazing? What were you thinking about this? Because that's a big complaint.
People are like, huge complaint.
So when men go on hormone replacement, they get testicular atrophy. Oftentimes physicians will use HCG to counterbalance this. This is now another 3 shots a week or so. And the fact that you would be able to take testosterone without shutting down FSH, LH, fertility potentially. I mean, I think that probably, I guess we'll see when the data comes out, but no testicular atrophy is huge.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, we're trying to sort of make people understand the importance of the therapy and get treated for the right reasons, right? So I think it's kind of like men's health. Men's health is a bit of an epidemic in itself, right? Guys notoriously don't have doctors. I think the stat is, between 18 and 40 or so, at least half or 60% of guys don't have doctors. Because again, most of the issues don't present, but say you bring in libido, right? Or ED, if you have an ED issue, you're going to show up at that doctor tomorrow, right?
So if you have erectile dysfunction, you will be knocking at the door.
Exactly. But that actually, in some sense, is a perfect opportunity to say, okay, let's test for your testosterone. Let's see what else is going on. Whether it's your cardiovascular system, whether are you pre-diabetic, right? What are some of the issues that are driving to this ED, right? So I think I actually, for providers and patients, like this is the best way to take charge of your health again, recognize this, and then go in and then again advocate, understand what you should be asking for. So at that point, again, ED is a vascular issue, right? So let's kind of address some of these issues.
Which could also be a metabolic issue.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
When you think about what are the issues that create an atmosphere of erectile dysfunction, low libido, low testosterone, in my mind, it definitely will start with metabolic dysfunction. I mean, maybe does it start there? Is it the chicken or the egg? Either way, it has to be addressed. But
I believe it's there, right? That I think that metabolic syndrome, dysfunction, just is so core to what's going on in this country and globally, and it needs to be discussed more. And what are the markers for it? So if we're able to bring those things to light, I think folks will be able to pay attention and treat them appropriately.
And speaking of this idea of metabolic profile. So there's many studies showing testosterone therapy has a positive impact on the progression from prediabetes to type 2 diabetes, improving lipid profiles, and reducing body fat, improving skeletal muscle. Are there specific metabolic benefits of oral testosterone therapy versus injectable?
So we're still studying this. And I think what's interesting, at least if I look at anecdotally on the anabolic side, right? Because of the circadian rhythm matching, anecdotally, we've seen better anabolic effects. So folks that have been on testosterone therapy for, say, extended period of time see a bit of a diminishing return, right? Whether that's the androgen receptor that's been overly saturated for too long and how it responds, it's a hypothesis. So I think going back and getting that time off, right? That nighttime is that time off.
I've never thought about that before.
It's, again, totally anecdotal, but this is something that we definitely want to study more, because I think it allows for patients and providers then to say, okay, we can use this as a wider tool in our toolbox.
So can you expand on that a little bit more? Basically, testosterone has this diurnal release, meaning typically is released twice a day. It follows a circadian rhythm. And you're saying that with the oral testosterone, it is different than injectable. And the impact of it almost augmenting, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but augmenting a circadian rhythm seems to have more of a beneficial effect than other forms of, if you're taking it 3 times a week because you're taking it sub-Q.
Right.
Or once a week.
At the end of the day, anything that's not daily is not physiological, right? I'll even say the term bioidentical is used a lot, right? To say, hey, look, this is a bioidentical hormone. But for example, if I'm putting pellets in you for 3 months, your testosterone is not produced for a 3-month period that way, right? So I think physiological
that's very fascinating.
Is bioidentical.
I do think that whether someone is a provider or is a patient or interested in this is a very good point, that if something is to be, quote, bioidentical, it should match the way in which the body is producing it.
Exactly.
And oral seems to be a way in which that makes a lot of sense. I do think that potentially we're going to see more about this idea of circadian biology. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can do and utilize medications that mimic and ride along with circadian biology, I personally believe that we're going to see more beneficial effects.
Right.
And then, the other thing that I would think about is, what about women? How do we think about the utilization of oral? Women use oral estradiol all the time. Sure. They've used oral birth control. Where are we at with understanding testosterone for women?
Sure. So I think it's a super interesting area if you think about it, right? And not to make this a male versus female, but you go into a pharmacy and you're a male, you have like 30 options to go and pick your choice. What do you want for testosterone, right? If you go for the females, there's not a single FDA-approved female testosterone. Zero, right? And that's just an injustice, right? But I think for the female side, what's happened since WHI 2 is that providers and people in this space have really understood how important testosterone is in a female body. And actually, testosterone premenopausal is at, I think it's 10, 20, 30 times the amount of estrogen in a body. Mm-hmm. So it is a female hormone. I think we have to get past this notion that it's just a male hormone. It is a female hormone, critical. And again, if testosterone affects depression in men or cognitive function, if it affects insulin sensitivity in men, if it affects bone health, muscle mass, tau proteins, whatever you want to, put out there in that sense, it has to have similar ramifications for the female. And I think what's happened is that because of guidelines, it's been pigeonholed into a sexual dysfunction issue.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not...
hyposexual. So it's typically used for hyposexual desire disorder.
But what about, again, the female that's 50 years old that has, early onset of osteoporosis, right? What about them? We know this is important in bone health. So again, total preface that this needs to be studied specifically in these populations. But I think what we need to see, honestly, is a thought process shift in the sense that females have testosterone deficiency as well. Full stop. It's not again a sexual dysfunction. It's not just one area of indication. We need to understand that they have this deficiency, and we should understand that it likely should be treated. And we can get into, obviously we can do the work to say, okay, these are the ranges, at least to give guidelines to practitioners and so forth. But let's not put this into a small bucket.
And then could Kyzatrex be used off-label for women?
Yeah, we don't obviously have an indication for it, so I can't recommend that. We are supporting research in this space, So we have investigators that have come to us and said, "Hey, look, we want to work on a female study, and we think these are the appropriate doses." And they've also gone to the FDA and said, "Hey, look, this is what we want to do."
I mean, we use, and I speak for many of the providers listening, and many of the people listening that are women. I'm sure many of them are taking testosterone, which would be considered off-label for low libido or even having low levels of testosterone. But I do think that if there is a way to mimic the natural circadian rhythm in men, we should also be offering at some point for women. Is something like this, if a provider was looking to offer it to women, is that something that you think will be available?
So as we discussed earlier, right, like providers have 100% clinical discretion in what they do, right? So they wanted to take Kyzatrex at 100 milligrams QD once a day and do that. That's totally their discretion. I think you're going to see, there's this massive menopause movement, I call it, right? Which is just, fabulous physicians that have gone out there and been really vocal around this space. And I think they understand and they talk about how important testosterone is, right? So female, I mean, anecdotally, I won't describe exactly how she's related in some sense, but I had a colleague, let's call it, call me and say, "Hey, look, I got back from a girls' weekend, 6 of them." She's like, 5 of 6 of us are on testosterone. And I'm like, wow, that's in some sense it's amazing, right? Because you feel better.
Yes.
Like that's what you're telling me.
Yes.
And so I think it's our job, providers and investigators, and then frankly, I think going back to that nonprofit that I mentioned.
Tell me about this nonprofit. What is it going to do for people?
Sure. So it's called the Testosterone Project, right? The testosterone.
I'm assuming it's about testosterone.
It's all about testosterone, absolutely. But we have 3 main missions, right? The first one is testosterone testing. Let's make this standard. This should be, frankly, the U.S. Preventive Task Force should say you should be measuring testosterone, because that's what's good in preventive task force, right?
Would it be free total? Have you guys thought about that?
Ideally, I'd love to talk about free testosterone, right? Because as a concept, that's really what we need to be talking about, because that's all that matters and all that you can use in your body. So I think it should be free. I mean, ideally, we look at total T, we look at free T, we look at SHBG, and I'll definitely get into that as well.
Yeah, because I'm curious, does SHBG go down with oral?
So uniquely, SHBG drops by in our phase 3 studies, SHBG dropped by 30%.
Wow. In
some of the abstracts that we're seeing published, this can range up to 50%.
So we have to take a pause, because I think that this is a really important concept. Sex hormone binding globulin is a protein that is made by the liver. And here's what happens. As individuals age, especially men and women, we see an increase in sex hormone binding globulin, which then binds free. Hormones are like children. They can't go anywhere by themselves. You need sex hormone binding globulin to walk around with them. And the issue with that is it binds free hormones. When you go on birth control, sex hormone binding or birth control, or even estradiol, anything oral, seems to elevate sex hormone binding globulin for a lifetime, which is a problem.
Right. So it's a massive problem for birth control. It's like that's I guess I don't want to say a ticking time bomb, but that's just huge issue.
If you then can no longer access the hormones that you're making. What you're telling me is that this oral formulation can actually lower sex hormone binding globulin. To me, that's, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, gosh, even if someone wants to use injectable, I would say, okay, if we measure your sex hormone binding globulin and your SHBG is elevated or higher, and when I think about elevation, whether it's between 60 or 80, to me, that's on the higher end, I'd love to see that lower. Would someone be able to administer an oral testosterone to lower that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's and again, I think you're just seeing it more prevalent, whether it's with age, some lifestyle things, even alcohol use, right? Yes. Has seen SHBG levels rise, and I think that's probably part of the issue, even with the younger male too. But yes, so we uniquely take down SHBG, and then what that does is allow the testosterone to be used. So free testosterone, as we refer to it, goes up. Phase 3 study, 2x. In abstracts, we've seen closer to 3 to 5x. So
That's wild.
And again, so what's really interesting in this new paradigm of testosterone therapy is we can see testosterone through oral rise to, let's call it mid-normal levels, right? Maybe you'll on average get to 800, right? 900. But your free T goes up preferentially. So the ratio of total T to free T is better.
Then it would be on an injectable or something else.
An injectable, you'll take your total T up, right? So you might go up to 1200, 1500. So that free T level might be the same then, but then you're also dealing with what are the consequences of having your super physiological testosterone for a longer period of time.
That's amazing. What would be some reason, a contraindication for men or women who are thinking about changing up the way in which they utilize testosterone?
I mean, frankly, as a comparator, the contraindication would be like, you don't like taking a pill.
Okay.
We haven't found any.
Like, would it make
you can
sleep
fact check
apnea?
me. You can find.
Yeah.
I can't find a reason why that again, unless you don't respond, right? Which again, our clinical trials, 96% of patients got to normal levels of testosterone. Let's call it even 80% in real world.
So it's interesting. Would it worsen sleep apnea the same way potentially an injectable will? Would any form of testosterone?
Right. So I'd love to do the research. I think we go back to our daily circadian rhythm. So like if your testosterone is effectively flushed from your body at the end of the day, the
it's pretty amazing.
What happens, right? So yeah, again, I'd love to call on any provider that's listening and say, hey, look, we'd love to run these studies because I think these are all incredibly important points to change the way that this therapy is viewed.
What about, I know that it's absorbed in the lymphatics and small intestine. What if someone has celiacs or some kind of Crohn's or just an inflammatory bowel disease?
Right. So there is data on this actually. So there is data around testosterone and Crohn's IBS. And we haven't seen issues dealing with absorption. So anecdotally, again, we have providers that deal mainly in GI and gut health and have not had, reports of saying, hey, look, Kyzatrex doesn't work. We definitely, again, we would love to do the research there because at the end of the day, like we talked about, our bodies are inflamed and most disease is caused by this. So if we can take down things like your CRP and your IL-6 and so forth, these are all inflammatory markers, right? If we can take those things down, there's a good chance that you can help some of these things.
Where do you kind of see the oral testosterone being synergistic? Have you thought about what are things just throwing this out there because I think it would be interesting. Do you think that there's some kind of synergistic effect of if we're going to make oral, or you already are making Kyzatrex, could there be some other synergistic oral compound potentially that one would use?
Sure. I think like we see it initially with other therapies, right? So like take, for example, GLP-1s. Obviously, this is a huge topic of today and a lot of people listening are familiar with them by now. But muscle loss is I'm sure you've talked about, right? To understand.
Nope, never talked about that. We don't even talk about muscle on this podcast.
We should definitely tell people about muscle.
No one is interested in muscle.
We need to definitely bring it up. But I think, outside of all of the things that one should be working on. So we with a partner of ours, they've launched a study to look at what muscle preservation is on semaglutide by itself versus semaglutide and Kyzatrex.
I mean, that's amazing.
So because again, I go back to pharma and right, they're looking at a lot of these assets that are frankly all the rage to say, hey, look, we know this is an issue. How do we work on this? Whether they're myostatin inhibitors or whatnot. But these are all early stage assets that honestly at one time or another had been discarded. And
when you say early stage asset, you mean Kyzatrex would be?
No. So these are like for muscle preservation, like Lilies of the World have partnered with other companies that they're like phase 2 or maybe even earlier. So these are probably 3-4 years away from an approval. Okay. Right?
So basically what you're saying is there's drugs that go through up to phase 3 trials.
Exactly.
And these are early early drugs that may have been discarded.
Exactly. And they may or may not work, right? Because again, you have to get through phase 3 trials where you're in enough of a population.
Right.
But I go back to testosterone being around for 100 years. People know it's safe. They know it works. It's crazy.
And then they schedule it in 1990. In the 90s, they then schedule it and create a barrier of entry for utilization.
Correct. And again, muscle is important. This is not the enemy here. We need to. We're an under-muscled country and under-muscled population. So how do you, again, and a lot of folks talk about, how do you make sure you can do the things you want to do as health span versus lifespan, right? Can you put your suitcase up in the plane, right? Like something as simple as that, or prevent a hip fracture. So sarcopenia, which we haven't even talked about, and again, we have all of these areas that
let's talk about sarcopenia. Let's talk about do we believe, or do you believe, or have you seen in the literature that the oral testosterone has a greater impact on certain areas, maybe more so than an injectable? Again, all testosterone, I believe all testosterone is beneficial.
Sure.
I know that there may be a uniquely beneficial fertility preserving aspect of oral. Do we feel like there are other, or do you think that there'll be other emerging data that this formulation of the way that this delivery system is done because of actually this really diurnal administration?
Right. So I think like you said, it will come back to that. And I think we will see, as we continue to do that research, we will see, let's call them very interesting effects on that population and again, various populations, right?
Wouldn't it be fascinating if the impact on skeletal muscle was greater because you're able to influence muscle clock genes?
Yeah,
absolutely. That would be phenomenal.
I think, again, just for patients to be able to really embrace these therapies and put them into their toolbox for, let's call it longevity, right? What is longevity? It is that living better and longer. But if you look at the pyramid, it's some of the foundational stuff, right? You got to eat well, you got to exercise, you got to sleep and manage your stress. I mean, mental health, right? This is a huge, huge issue for both male and female. But again, it's often ignored. So I'll just talk about that for 1 second. Again, our best friend Mohit Kira did an amazing paper on depression and low testosterone, where he found this was about 1,000 patients, so not a small number by any means. 92% of patients had depressive symptoms and low testosterone. Almost 20% of patients had moderately severe depression in that analysis, and actually, that moderately severe group, I think that went from, again, it was 17 and change down to 2% after 3 months and 12 months of testosterone therapy.
Isn't that crazy?
Huge. Again, and that's why, as I said when we started, all of these things are intertwined. Go back to testing, right? If these folks, or men or women, were just tested, right, you would understand this, and then you would have a better approach to their treatment paradigm, right? And we know SSRIs are out there, and I'm sure they've helped a lot of people, but they're not the end-all be-all by any means. So how do you make sure, what's the root problem? Let's find out what's going on there.
And how do you guys plan on educating the public? I mean, you're doing this. I mean, this is really, I was so glad you're willing to come on, and so glad you're willing to support the podcast because it's needed. But how else? So the podcast, educational outreach, do you guys have a game plan for that?
So I mean, again, it's really just it's kind of a full court press on all outlets, right? Obviously you have your channels through traditional PR, you have new media like this, social media. I mean, rethinktestosterone.com, that's our disease state website, and all we do is look at these literature and these studies and bring light to them, because what we've seen, at least in our journey, is that the research has been tremendous. So I think on a previous podcast you had mentioned, the Androgen Society, right? Great minds, all focused on andrology, and folks like Abe Morgan-Taylor, who we work really closely with since inception, and he's been doing this for probably 40 years, right? The data is so good, but it's kind of lived in a vacuum. And so we've kind of said, okay, let's take the next step. We need that microphone. The Testosterone Project as a nonprofit, our goal there is obviously using science as our foundation, but we see this as being a 1 million patient strong advocacy group.
So what is the testosterone project going to do?
Those three things. We're going to look at testing. Second is going to be female testosterone. So how do we go to the FDA and say a trial for females should look like a male trial? We shouldn't have these onerous expectations or thousands and thousands of patients that need to be trialed, because we know that's why folks have stayed away from this, because they've made it infeasible to run these studies, even though the data exists, right? We know it's good. We know it works. Why are they holding ground, right? Again, Traverse should have, frankly, the FDA should have came out already and changed the label. They should have fixed the label. They did it. They asked for Traverse, and then Traverse came out.
Traverse trial was the trial that looked at the impact on cardio. There was multiple arms.
Multiple arms, prostate, etc. Main one was cardiovascular, right? 5,000 patients. Gold standard, randomized, placebo-controlled, right? This took 7 years and hundreds of millions of dollars because the FDA said, hey, look, you have to do this. And so they should actually, frankly, they should have came out already and changed that label. But they haven't. So I think, again, Marius is taking steps there, but I think the testosterone project is really for patients to say, hey, look, we have a voice here, and what you do, the decisions you're making are impacting our health.
Yeah.
Right? So the third point in that is descheduling testosterone.
How long do you think that? Have you talked to our colleagues? How long do you think that how does something like that even happen?
Sure. So we're pretty.
It's
a good question, right? So we're fairly active in DC, right? Again, if you asked me 7 years ago, would I say, hey, I'd be, going lobbying Congress every month and trying to, move the needle there? No, absolutely not.
And how does that work? You just go, you show up, you say, hey, man,
it's education.
By the way, have you ever tried, you know what you should do? You should put it in the water.
Yeah, absolutely.
You should put it in their water. And then have you just been feeling so amazing lately?
Absolutely. I invite any member of Congress or anybody in the Senate to call us and get on Kyzatrex. Because I think, again, frankly, like patient stories, understanding what this means, right?
So how to make this unscheduled? Do you have to go to Washington? What does someone do?
So it's a combination of I think, congressional support and understanding, again, this is good for patients, people. Again, at the end of the day, Congress represents people, right? So that's why the Testosterone Project, as a patient advocacy, can speak to them. If we have 1 million patients or 500,000, whatever that is, coming and saying, hey, look, here's the data, here's the science. And that's the beauty. We're not shooting from the hip.
Right.
It's so supported. And you take that and you say, look, let's pay attention to this. This matters, right? We talk a lot about insulin prices and so forth. That's one healthcare topic and access and all these things. But this is let's call it an easy thing, I think, for them to get behind. So then they have to work with the agencies, right? The FDA, the DEA controls it because they control scheduled products. That falls into their purview. And then the FDA is, of course, going to opine as well. DEA is not a scientific agency.
Right.
So FDA is going to opine. And that's why we're asking the FDA, be scientific. This is not 20 years ago. This is not 30 years ago. We have the data that says what's safe.
We are hearing over and over again that testosterone is safe for men and women. When it comes to telemedicine, right, there's an increase in telemedicine clinics, telemedicine practices. Do you think that that's breaking down barriers to access? And where does Kyzatrex fit into that scope?
Absolutely. So I think telehealth is breaking down barriers. It's a much needed solution in our system. I mean, look, in this country, we already have a shortage of doctors, right? That's just bar none. We have a shortage of doctors, and then we have a shortage of specialists, especially hormonal specialists, right? So as we talk about patients and they're seeking help, where do they go? Right? I think if everybody could go to their provider or their current provider and have that sort of, let's call it TLC, right? I mean, the system is set up that a provider has 7 minutes with you, right? How in the world for a society that
erectile
has these
dysfunction
issues,
go?
Yeah, like you got all these issues, right?
Yeah.
How can you go over them and take control of your health? It's impossible. So I think I think telehealth provides an outlet for these patients. I think there will be in all sort of new areas, right? There's a spectrum of providers, and I think there's going to be your great holistic providers down to the folks that maybe shouldn't be there, right?
Yeah.
But the beauty is that that's why we have a regulatory system, and those can be addressed. But at large, if it takes 6 months to see a urologist or endocrinologist who may or may not actually still be good.
It's actually really tough.
Yeah.
It's really tough. So if I, as a provider or even as a patient, say, okay, someone comes to me and says, let's put it from a physician standpoint. My patient comes to me and says, you know what, Gabrielle, I have been reading about Kyzatrex. I want to take it. Mm-hmm. How do I, as a provider, go about prescribing it, or what is the interaction with that patient?
So for you, as a practicing physician provider, like that's relatively easy. We have pharmacies that are set up, mail order pharmacies, so it's not going to be sent into your CVS. We have set the distribution network such to basically control the pricing, so it doesn't get high for the patient.
And it's $150.
$159 if you send it to there, which is frankly the copay for a lot of people's drugs anyway.
Which is amazing.
So yeah, I think that's very, very reasonable. We do have some, let's call it concierge practices, or there's testosterone programs. What you see today often are bundle programs. So maybe it's the physician visit, the labs, and Kyzatrex, right? That might be $199 a month. But I think there's tremendous value in now, again, physicians can either send it to a mail order pharmacy or they can create the programs.
And would they go to the Kyzatrex website too? So if there's physicians listening and they're like, wow, which I really strongly recommend. And again, I'm not giving medical advice. The goal is to educate.
Right.
A lot of providers listen to this podcast. I strongly recommend they try it for their patients. Again, my husband tried it. He's still taking it. And it just was so much easier for him. Some guys don't like needles and the gels. We have 2 little kids. I didn't want him using any kind of gel preparation because I didn't want to get it on our kids.
Right.
So if someone is interested, they would Google Kyzatrex.
Yep. Kyzatrex.com.
Right.
For the physician, they can go to the provider side. There's a clear link how to get it. And there are our pharmacy partners. So we have a couple pharmacy partners, depending on how your practice is set up. One will fit it. No matter how you're currently doing it, one of our pharmacy partners will fit the way that your practice runs.
And just out of curiosity, what is the dosing? So the highest dose is 400 twice a day. What are some of the other dosing?
So then the other 2 most common doses will just step down to 300 milligrams BID, and then you'll have a 200 milligram BID dose.
Okay, and let's just say, I know that it's not FDA approved, but let's just say someone were interested in, so the 300 or 200, how could we think about that? Obviously it's not the same as an injectable.
Sure.
But would that be, for example, when we think about giving testosterone to a woman based on an injectable, right? It would be, maybe we would give them maybe 5 milligrams, whereas a male we might give 100 to 200.
Right.
How would we, or is there a way to think about it?
Sure. So usually see like a 1/10 of a dose, right? That's kind of the rule of thumb. So, right, if we have 800 milligrams is a common male dose, you do have a 100 milligram capsule that is, so it's 1/8. It's not exactly, but it's 1/8 of a that could be, I guess, a female dose. We are, again, supporting a study that is actually going to look at a 50 milligram dose. So that's going to start as well.
That's amazing. And then would that come from a compounding pharmacy? How?
So no, okay. Kyzatrex is not compounded, full stop, right? Kyzatrex, again, is FDA approved, and we have our manufacturer partner for the last 12 years, right, since our early studies that makes Kyzatrex. And it's, I guess, a good way for the listeners to think about it is it's like it's a soft gel. So it's kind of like a fish oil capsule.
Yes.
Right? I wish I had one in my pocket. But
we probably have some upstairs. Let's just check Matthew's bag.
Exactly. But again, it's like a fish oil capsule. Yeah. So it would not be compounded. I think that's a,
important point.
Important point for patients to understand. It comes directly from us. Whenever it's coming from the pharmacy, you're coming in a 1 month supply, 120 tablets in that bottle, and that's a 1 month supply. So very simple.
And if someone was interested in getting a smaller dose, like a 50 or 100, they would contact?
So the 100 milligram dose is commercially available.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. 50 milligrams.
Oh, I see. So the
yeah.
200 is 100 twice a day.
Well, so no, there's actually a 200 milligram capsule.
And a
There's a
300.
150 that you take twice with that. And then there's a 100 milligram capsule. So we have 3 different capsule strengths to get to those doses.
Oh, I see. Oh, amazing. Okay.
So there's a lot of flexibility there for the provider, right? Again, depending on how people respond. What we do see anecdotally, often, again, injection switches tend to be at that higher dose.
So can you give me an example of what it would look like to transition someone from if they were taking 200 milligrams a week?
So if they're anywhere from, if we've seen anywhere from 100 to 200 milligrams test sip a week, right? Often still that 400 milligram dose works. So what I'll share is, actually, so this is again being published in October 2024, but it looked at patients all on 400 milligrams BID twice a day. And if you look at the efficacy parameters, whether that's total T or free T, you see, again, the rises that you would expect. But interestingly enough, too, on the hematocrit side or the LH, FSH side, you don't see hematocrit spike. I think the data will show it won't get above 50 in this patient group.
Which is great.
It's really reassuring, right? For both patients and providers. And then again, your LH and FSH don't drop to 0.
I mean, that's amazing.
So they're active.
Preservation of fertility.
We haven't talked about is also the conversion to estrogen.
Because that's
please. A big
let's
concern
talk about that.
For injection patients.
Yes. What is the average conversion of testosterone to estrogen if it's injected? I think it's... do you know the number?
I don't know offhand what the exact conversion is.
I have to look. I want to say it's between 6 and 10%. I'm not sure.
Right. But it often goes back to super physiological levels. You have this, you're going to convert more to estrogen. So for us, that our testosterone to estrogen levels stay in line. So you don't see folks taking an anastrozole, right? That's often, honestly, with injections, right? In a lot of places, that's like, comes automatically with your testosterone script. And we don't see that, which I think is quite nice, because at the end of the day, estrogen is also an important hormone for the male. Yeah. It's also a male hormone
too.
It
is.
Right?
Yes, it is.
So we don't want to take that down or block it.
I didn't realize that there is less of an estrogen conversion. Do you think that the oral may be better for people, and I'm just speculating here, with body composition issues?
Absolutely. I think it's a good point, right? Because again, if you have body composition issues and you're taking a gel, for example, right?
Yes.
Adipose is filled with that, and it's going to convert. So I think that's why we see a lot of sort of obese folks struggle on therapy and then on AIs and whatnot. So and just the variability in sort of absorption, right?
Yes.
I think this provides a great solution for them.
Because whether sub-Q or IM, you still have to get through that tissue. I also think that it provides a great solution. Where do you think this is going in the future? Where are you guys hoping that Kyzatrex gets to? Are you hoping that, I don't know, that there's some for men, some for women, that it is easily accessible? Where is it going?
Yeah, no, good question. So I think it's a bit of both, for sure, right? Again, we were definitely, we're committed to the research, for sure.
Which is, Mo always says, follow the science. Follow the science.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think we, honestly, in our we know it's down the right path. Again, the literature, there's no shortage of good data.
Which is why I wanted you to come on and talk about it.
So we just need to continue to show the story with Kyzatrex, to be honest, right? So if you think about the male side, you think about future research in women. And a lot of people ask me this. They actually ask, okay, hey, what's your next product? And I just pause and I say, look at all the things testosterone does. We don't need another product. Yeah. We need to educate and make sure that, yes, we are doing the research and showing what that is in these different populations or different comorbidities, right? I think that's really where the greatest good will come to the public, is understanding that and then thinking, okay, hey, and also, again, we want to show it. I love to have it on our label for, a type 2 diabetic. Or you look at that
would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean,
Wouldn't
look
it
at that.
be?
Look
Yes.
at the sheer number of type 2 diabetics we have in this country, or the dollars that are going in healthcare spending because of this, right? So if we could, T4DM, I'll bring up this study. It was done in Australia, probably published in 2020 now, maybe 21. Again, 1,000 patients, randomized controlled trial, and it looked at the progression of prediabetes to type 2 diabetes, and it was almost nil progression of that. And then you also look at the reversal of type 2 diabetes down to a normal glucose A1C. Actually, they used OGTT, which is even a better metric,
Which is an oral glucose tolerance test. Yeah.
exactly. And you kind of scratch your head and you say, well, why is this not being talked about when we have this massive issue? And that's why we've actually gotten great interest from countries around the world, or even in like places like Saudi Arabia or UAE, who have higher diabetic rates than the US, believe it or not, which is hard to fathom. But they have this very high or keen interest on testosterone therapy.
Is testosterone therapy, is Kyzatrex available outside the US?
So we are available in the UK under early access programs. We have.
What does that mean?
So early access programs are effectively like named patients, so single patients. So say your doctor is aware of Kyzatrex and he says this is the best, he or she says this is the best solution for you. They can get access to it, right? So it's I guess similar to an approval, but there is access. It's actually we've already applied for approval, so that's underway anyway. So there will be a full approval likely in the United Kingdom. We've applied for approval in Canada already, and then we're looking at these other countries that again we've received strong interest for, and we know the
And is
patient population.
Kyzatrex the only oral available of its kind?
So in the U.S. there are two other products.
But they require I think double the dosing.
So the bioavailability,
And it has to be with a fatty meal, which I don't really want patients on multiple high-fat meals.
correct. So yeah, I think they have their own dosing issues,
Yeah.
if you will. And then again, it comes down to
that's
access.
what I've seen. I mean, so that's what I've seen. I've seen barriers to entry in two ways. Number one, the absorption for other forms of oral testosterone require a high-fat meal, at least 50 grams of fat, multiple times a day. So that's too high,
Sure.
because then it kind of crowds out for other nutrients, especially dietary protein, and then access.
Right.
So it's not necessarily easy to
They cost over $1,000 a month.
Yeah.
For us.
I mean, that's insane.
Exactly. I mean,
It's insane.
you're not going to get coverage, or again, you're
You're
going to
not
pay
going to
that.
you're not going to get coverage, and I can't ask patients to spend over $1,000 a month.
Exactly. That's when again you say, okay, you have to use an injection, which is fair and fine. But so we have these other things, but again, frankly, for us, we think the market is so large. This is just a massive problem. So we want the awareness to grow, and I want everybody to do well in that sense. But I think we just have developed what should be the standard of care for those multiple reasons.
And where do you want to see it going? So obviously you have the Testosterone Project, where you want there to be patient advocacy. You want testosterone deschedulized. I totally agree with all of that. You want there to be more research on women. In 5 years from now, where do you want Kyzatrex to be?
So I think, I want it to lead with the science, right? I think in 5 years, in 5 years, if we are successful with that science and education, you could see 10 million men in the U.S. on Kyzatrex, and more globally. But what you're going to see is actually, I love to over time show some of the curves that we have around metabolic disease, and I love to start correcting them. Right? Through not just Kyzatrex, but also this mindset of foundational health, right? Or preventive health. And I'd love to start correcting those curves. And that to me will be, tremendous success.
So meaningful. Well, Shalin Shah, CEO of Marius Pharmaceuticals, I'm hoping that you will be willing to come back on when you get some of these papers published and out. What you are doing, I think, is tremendous. I think, number one, you offer a solution. You offer a solution to a healthcare crisis. It is very commonly talked about, this obesity epidemic. It is, very commonly discussed cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease. There are two, in my opinion, there are two core problems. This is the problem with metabolism and muscle, and feeding into that, whether it's the chicken or the egg, is this problem with hormones. And if we can combine the two, which I think Kyzatrex makes things very accessible, and you guys are so dedicated to education and science that I'm so grateful. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. I'll leave your listeners with a bit of a cliffhanger because you mentioned Alzheimer's. And so the research actually will show testosterone deficiency will lead to an increase in tau proteins. And tau proteins are one of the best indicators we have to the development of Alzheimer's beyond, obviously the genetic typing and so forth. So this is some area that we are also going to pursue. So I'll leave that as a cliffhanger because we're going to get into it. And hopefully by the next time I'm on, we have something to share.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.